Hello everyone from Ukraine. You're watching Channel 24. My name is Andriy Drozda and our guest today is Mr. Taras Kuzyo, Professor of Political Science of the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. He is an expert on politics, crime and security in Russia, Ukraine and Eurasia. Mr. Kuzyo, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I would like to discuss with you how this war, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, changed our Ukrainian relations with various countries. In 2 weeks, there will be midterm elections in the United States of America, and we can see some activities from both sides of the political spectrum in the USA. On one side, there are Trump supporters in the Republican Party, and they have their specific opinion about the Russian war in Ukraine. And there are also so-called left-wing Democrats, such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and some others, who now urge Joe Biden, the president, to hold direct talks to Vladimir Putin in order to end the war in Ukraine. So how much can these elections affect American cooperation and support of Ukraine? Is there any chance of significant changes?
I don't think there will be significant changes. I think that basically the same configuration in Western countries will remain, and we have to be always careful not to assume that everything is black and white. There's a lot of kind of gray as well, because, for example, the new leader of Italy is on the far right, but she's very anti-Putin, very anti-Russian, very pro-Ukrainian. And it's the same. Look at the differences between Poland and Hungary. Both have right-wing populist nationalist governments, but one is anti-Russian and supporting Ukraine very strongly, and one is playing with Russia. So it's a mixed picture. It's not sort of just black and white. I think in the case of the US, I actually just tweeted that, and I calculated that of the members of the US House of Representatives, the lower house, approximately 27% of the Republicans have always voted against supporting Ukraine. So 27%. So that means that it's not the majority of the party. In the Democratic Party, these so-called progressives, I hate this word, progressives, so the far left of the Democratic Party, it's 14%, so 30 members. So here you have 57 Republicans and 30 Democrats. This is absolutely normal, because in practically all European countries, the far left and the far right are either pro-Russian, or they are realists, they want negotiations, or they're just naive. And on the left, they're often anti-American, including American far left. So I don't think that the American political configuration is that unusual, and I don't think it's going to change that much, particularly because, again, we have to be cautious about comparing the Trump administration to Obama. Obama in Ukraine is a dirty word. Why? Because he completely ignored the Budapest Memorandum. He vetoed all military aid to Ukraine. Trump did not veto military aid to Ukraine. Trump actually supported military aid to Ukraine. He let it go. He didn't veto it. So let's just leave it at that. But all of Trump was terrible when he tried to be sort of very close and pally and friendly with Putin. He was pretty disgusting, actually. But at the same time, all of the people around Trump were very good on Russia. Fiona Hill and in the Defense Department and in the Foreign Ministry, Department of State, all of them were very good. Plus, we also have to remember that inside Washington, all of the think tanks, and there are very many of them, are anti-Russian and pro-Ukrainian. I mean, there's, I think, just one, the Nixon Center, which is kind of pro-Russian. But all of the other ones on the Democrat side and the Republican side are all. So I don't think much will change. I think The countries in which Ukraine has had strong support will remain strong supporters, and that includes my own country, Britain. I don't think it will make a difference if the Labour Party comes to power, because the extreme left of the Labour Party are now in the dustbin of history. They lost the elections in 2019, and they're not going to ever come back. So I don't think there'll be much change. And also the countries in which Ukraine is disappointed, which is, I think, the two big countries are Canada and Israel. You forgot to mention Canada. Canada, I think, is one country that Ukrainians are very disappointed with. They will remain disappointed in. I mean, I hope Israel changes its stance, but so I don't think there will be much change in the way. Especially as well, another factor to take into account is that the energy crisis is not going to be as bad as many people thought, because the prices of gas are already coming down, and also the EU has been extremely successful in getting rid of its dependency on Russian gas. So it's now down to about 7% of reliance on Russian gas, and that's a product of LNG and gas coming from like Azerbaijan, from Algeria, and from the United States. So actually, typically, Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin have shot themselves in the foot by threatening this gas or energy war, and they're the ones who are naturally going to be defeated on this, because who is going to buy Russian gas, which accounts for 40% of the Russian budget? Who's going to buy it? You can export oil on tankers. You can't export gas unless it's converted into LNG. And Russia does not have that capability. So I think Russia will lose out there. So I think pretty much things will remain as they are, including with the new British Prime Minister as well. But it's a very good signal that he's kept Ben Wallace as Defense Minister.
For years, Russia tried to invest their money, their resources in various populist in European countries from both sides of the political spectrum, from far rights and ultra-wing left, ultra-leftists and so on. Should we say, looking at Italy and the results of their elections and other countries, Germany and so on, and their position, can we tell that this Russian policy of corrupting European politicians have failed and it wasn't successful?
Well, we have to remember that Russia didn't create these extreme groups on the left or right. What Russia does is that Russia takes advantage of these extreme groups on the right and left. So they already exist. There are already conditions in these countries that have created this support for the far right and far left. But we also have to take into account that not all, for example, populist nationalists are pro-Russian. There are many cases in Europe, in Scandinavia, in Poland, in Britain, where the populist nationalists are not pro-Russian, they're anti-Russian. I don't actually see any Russophilism in Britain. In France, which was probably the greatest place where Russia invested, there was always a big degree of Russophilism, always. I remember talking to Ukrainian diplomats in the 1990s, and they would always complain about the French, that France always treated Ukraine as a kind of a part of Russia, or a kind of a little brother of Russia. And so when Ukraine said we want to join the EU, the response would be, well, we can't let you into the EU because then we have to let Russia in. And the Ukrainian diplomats would say, why are you linking us to Russia always? So that Russophilism was always there, and the reason for that was because of anti-Americanism in France. Anti-Americanism creates pro-Russianism. The Kremlin has taken advantage of that by supporting Le Pen and the far right. And they are still, I think, that is the country, I think, with the greatest potential danger of this pro-Russian far right coming to power. But I think every time there's been a threat, what's happened is that all of the other groups, both on the left and the right, have come together to try to block Le Pen coming to power. In Germany, the far right is far smaller in size, and the alternative for Germany. And I think what's happened in Germany is that the Germans have grown up. They're no longer children in foreign policy. They were extremely naive about Russia. They thought that trade and keeping contacts, diplomacy would kind of influence the type of regime in Russia. They were completely wrong. This was a false analogy. So that Ostpolitik has been discredited completely. And so I think that most German politicians today are on the same page regarding supporting Ukraine. Whether they're supporting enough is a different matter. So I think on the whole throughout Europe, yes, I think Russia has spent a lot of money, just like it spent a lot of money on social media, on Russia Today and things like this. And the productivity from this is actually often quite low. One reason for that today as well is that it's embarrassing today to be pro-Russian. After all the war crimes, the description of the Russian regime as fascist and totalitarian, the claims that Russia is committing genocide in Ukraine, all of this now makes it very embarrassing to say, yes, I'm pro-Putin. So you are a pro-genocide person? Is that what you're saying? I mean, so I think formerly people who were pro-Putin populist nationalists are now kind of keeping quiet. They're not as active as they were, especially in 2014. So I think that's also had to influence the political electorate. And that's probably a reason why the leader of Italy sees that it's not a popular question today to be pro-Putin. It's now probably not good for her to be pro-Putin because there is tremendous sympathy amongst people throughout Europe, and I see in Britain there are Ukrainian flags everywhere, literally everywhere, and same in Ireland. This was not the case in 2014. Now this is all new. So it's not electorally popular anymore to be pro-Putin, pro-Russian.
Yeah, and we can really see how significantly the German official rhetoric towards Ukraine is changing. This week, Germany and the EU and the European Union were hosting the international conference to discuss the reconstruction of Ukraine, and Chancellor Olaf Scholz in his speech was very optimistic about the recovery of Ukraine. He recognizes Ukraine as the future member of the European Union, and he calls for a Marshall Plan for the 21st century to help Ukraine. Why do we see such a significant changes in German rhetoric towards Ukraine? It was pretty restrained in February and March, and now it's sympathetic, I would say.
I wouldn't say it's so restrained. We have to, I can be very critical that Germany could be doing more. It could be sending more military equipment. But at the same time, Germany has completely changed since before the invasion in terms of its kind of foreign policy. And ironically, the political party in Germany, which is the most anti-Russian, is the Green Party.
Yes.
That's the big irony of Germany. So I think now, just think about it, nobody believed until the invasion that Germany would say no to Nord Stream 2. Germany has. Nord Stream 2 is finished. Now German politicians are saying this was a big mistake because it was part of this Ostpolitik kind of naivety. That's all gone. And Germany now sees the need to increase defense spending, sees the need to adopt a more assertive position vis-a-vis Russia. I think Germans now, like most Europeans, and I think Americans as well, understand that the future of the Western world is being decided in Ukraine. That if Ukraine is defeated in this war, I don't think it will be, but if Ukraine was defeated, then the war would then happen directly between NATO and Russia. At the moment, the war is indirect. NATO is fighting a war indirectly with Russia through Ukraine. If Ukraine is defeated, then it's next in the Baltic states, next Poland. Nobody is. So I think people understand this. I think the countries in Europe. I saw an opinion poll a few weeks ago where actually the three countries in Europe where the potentially public support is not as high as it should be is in Hungary, which we're not surprised about. Although it makes me. I'm totally confused as to why Hungarians have forgotten about 1956. But Hungarians, Greeks, but Greeks traditionally were pro-Russian.
And Cyprus, probably?
Yeah, it didn't do Cyprus separately. It said Hungary, Greece, and Italy. But you know, it was because it was comparing very high support in countries like Britain or America. So even the Republicans in America have to take into account that something like 75% of Americans support giving military aid to Ukraine. In some countries like Canada, the public support for Ukraine is high, but the government is not doing anything or not doing very much. So then in some countries, including in Germany, you asked about Germany, public support for Ukraine is very high, and I think the public would like the government to do more. Now, some people say it's partly psychological. The Germans find it difficult to see German tanks again in Ukraine fighting Russia, because it reminds them of World War II. But I think that's maybe an excuse. But you know, today German air defense systems are helping Ukraine. They are inside Ukraine, and they are doing a good job in protecting Ukrainian airspace. So I think it's again a mixed picture. I think Germany has changed. Whether it's changed enough is a different question. But certainly, I think the German public is completely on Ukraine's side. It's 70% plus supporting Ukraine, and so political parties have to take this into account. In Britain, also, it's the same.
Okay, and from your perspective, how are Ukraine's relations with Israel developing? Why it is so hard to provide this dialogue right now, and why the government of Israel still refusing to provide Ukraine with air defense systems?
It is really strange because not only because Ukraine has a Jewish president, and not only because Ukraine has the biggest Jewish revival in Europe since the last 30 years in Dnipropetrovsk, which I visited on many occasions. I've stayed in the hotel in the menorah in Dnipropetrovsk, and also because Ukraine has the biggest Jewish gathering outside Israel in September every year, when 30,000 Jews come to Uman. So it is strange that this is all happening, and Israel is turning its back, especially because many people in Israel are from Ukraine. They are immigrants from Ukraine. And the excuse that Israel gives is that they don't want to have a conflict with Russia inside Syria. I think this is an excuse. I don't think this is a real reason, because Israel and Azerbaijan, for example, have a very close security relationship for the last 20 years. Israel sells Azerbaijan drones. Everybody knows Turkey sells Azerbaijan drones, but they also forget that Israel sells them as well to Azerbaijan. And even though Azerbaijan is Muslim, Israel is Jewish, they have a very close relationship because of Iran, because both are on the border with Iran. And so if Israel has a close relationship with Iran, why can it, with Azerbaijan, why can it not have a close relationship with Ukraine? Iran is actually using Ukraine to test and improve its drones, which it then will use later against Israel. So Ukraine is a testing ground for a future conflict with those same Iranian drones against Israel. And there is no such thing as a free lunch, we know. And so in return for Iran supplying these drones to Russia, Russia will obviously help Iran become a nuclear weapon state. So it makes no rational or logical sense that Israel doesn't understand this. And I've said this on Twitter, that is the Israeli intelligence services asleep? Are they on holiday? Because how can you not understand this? And so I think it is ridiculous that Israel is staying neutral from this, because Russia is not neutral when it has an alliance now with Iran. Ukraine is at war with three countries: Iran, Russia, and Belarus. And not because Ukraine declared war; they declared war on Ukraine. And so Israel should understand that there's a common alliance with Ukraine against Iran, just like there's a common alliance with Azerbaijan against Iran.
Yeah, it is really strange that Israel doesn't understand this, or doesn't show any understanding publicly, because they always had very professional intelligence services, and right now something strange is happening. How would you express?
The only speculation I can give is that it's nothing to do with geopolitics, and it's all to do with ethnic stereotypes. This image of Ukrainians as Nazis, which the Russians have been promoting, which the Kremlin is promoting, and which was promoted by the Soviet regime as well, is believed by many Israelis. And remember that John Demyanuk, this American Ukrainian, was put on trial.
So-called Ivan Grozny, so-called, yeah.
Yes, and so I think this is the real reason. They still have this kind of stereotypes about Ukrainians, which is actually the same stereotypes that Russia is promoting. So I think that is the real reason, but they will never admit this.
Yeah, so here we have how the Russian propaganda still works in Israel. Okay, how would you describe Ukrainian cooperation with Turkish countries, or Turks countries, Turkey and Azerbaijan especially? How can these relations affect the situation in Eastern Europe, in Caucasian region in the long term?
This war taking place in Ukraine is a repeat of 1991. It's the second disintegration of the Russian Empire. And by Russian Empire, I mean in terms of what Russia sees. Most Russians do not see Russia as the Russian Federation. They see Russia as the Eurasia, as the former Soviet Union. And this war has led to the collapse of Russian sphere of influence in Eurasia. There are only two countries now in Eurasia which are pro-Russian puppet states: Belarus and Armenia. Central Asian states have moved away from Russia. They're now more under Chinese influence, particularly Kazakhstan. And none of these countries want to support Russia over its imperialism, annexation of territories, and recognition of so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. So none of these countries support this. Particularly Kazakhstan, of course, is worried that Russian nationalists want to annex northern Kazakhstan. So Russia is completely isolated, not only internationally, but within Eurasia also. And in the last United Nations vote, only Belarus supported Russia inside the former Soviet Union. Armenia abstained, and including China, like China and India. So I think these Turkic countries like Kazakhstan and Central Asia have completely moved away from Russia because of this war. Azerbaijan, I think, is the most interesting because it tried to adopt this Kuchma-like multi-vector foreign policy to keep good relations with Russia, but also be pro-Western, pro-Turkish. And now it's in the last week or so, it's moved into being totally pro-Ukrainian. So in the South Caucasus now, you have this strange situation where Azerbaijan is the most pro-Ukrainian country. It should be Georgia. Traditionally it was Georgia. But Georgia is controlled by a Russian oligarch. I mean, he's Georgian, but he's basically a Russian oligarch. And he made all his money, he made his billions of dollars in Russia in the 1990s, and I'm sure that the FSB, the Russian intelligence services, have compromat on him. You cannot make so much money without doing things illegally in the 1990s Wild West capitalism. So unfortunately, Georgia is controlled by a pro-Russian oligarch, and even though majority of Georgian people support Ukraine, I mean, it's the difference between the leadership of the country and the population of Georgia. Georgians are pro-Ukrainian. Azerbaijan and Azerbaijan has been providing free petrol, free diesel and petrol for Ukrainian ambulances and for Ukrainian trucks. So if you are a Ukrainian ambulance driver, you can go to a Azerbaijani Sokar, S-O-C-A-R, Azerbaijani petrol station in Ukraine, and you will get free petrol. So Azerbaijan has been supporting Ukraine, and now has come out even stronger in the last few days because of the Iranian question. 1/3 of the population of Iran is Azerbaijani, and Iran is very pro-Armenian. So it's the axis is Russia, Armenia, Iran, and the alternative axis is Azerbaijan, Turkey. Azerbaijan now has come out strongly on Ukraine's side and condemned Russian annexation, Russian imperialism. Turkey has a very large Crimean Tatar minority since the 19th century. They fled after Crimea was annexed by the Russian Empire in 1783. And so any Turkish government has to take into account this question. So Turkey has always voted in the United Nations against the annexation of Crimea, and has always supported Ukraine in the United Nations on votes, always condemned Russian policy at the United Nations. Turkey has also refused to sell Bayraktar drones to Russia, only to Ukraine, which forced Russia then to go to Iran to look for drones. It could not get them from Turkey. And Turkey also was very helpful in releasing prisoners of war from Azovstal, and also in helping Ukraine export grain. So I think Turkey's done an incredible job in it's tried to play to be still good relations with Russia, but Turkey ultimately is a member of NATO, so it's always going to be on NATO's side, and Turkey supports the admission of Finland and Sweden into NATO, and supports Ukraine's NATO membership. So I think Turkey is also playing a positive role here, and is a powerful ally of Ukraine, and that also gives Azerbaijan the ability to also support Ukraine, because Azerbaijan knows that it has a strong friend in Turkey. Russia cannot do anything against Azerbaijan because Turkey would intervene.
Got it. And I would ask you about some speculation about the moods of Russian political elites right now. Have those political elites in Russia already realized that they had lost the war in Ukraine? Or are they still in the denial mode?
I think the source of this problem is that nobody in Moscow, nobody amongst Russian so-called elites, that's politics, think tanks, academics, journalists, none of them understand Ukraine. And it's very interesting when you compare this to Poland, where in Poland you've had in the last 20, 30 years a complete change in mentality towards Ukrainians. And that's why in Poland there's an understanding of Ukraine. In Russia there's no understanding of Ukraine, and therefore they cannot reach the conclusion that they are being defeated, because they don't understand what is going on. How can these people... First of all, you deny Ukrainians exist. People that do not exist are defeating the Russians. It sounds ridiculous, but this is the basis of why Russia organized not an invasion, a special military operation which would last 3 days with only 175,000 troops, because Ukraine is ruled by a small group of Nazis who came to power in the Euromaidan on behalf of Washington. Once we remove those, the little Russians in Ukraine would say, "Spasiba, thank you very much." And we're all happy to go back to Mother Russia. Anybody who knew anything about Ukraine understood this was complete rubbish. This was completely ridiculous. But they really did believe this, and they continue to believe this. So I think this blocks them understanding what is happening in the war. The only way they can explain this is to say, well, it's not really Ukrainians fighting, it's NATO fighting against them. Which again, of course, I mean, it's ridiculous. They don't, I think that's one aspect of it. The second problem they have is that they are truly have this very deep mythology that they are a great power. And they are not. Ukraine showed that by the miserable state of the Russian army. And this mobilization that's taking place now is a disgrace. If you are a Russian patriot, you should be embarrassed by it. How can you take these poor young men and give them one-day training and throw them into a war where they will be definitely killed? This is so... And Russian, you have the embarrassment that Russian soldiers coming to Ukraine see a higher standard of living in Ukraine than in Russia. If you are a Russian patriot, you should be asking yourself, how come we are an oil and gas producer with diamonds and other gold and other raw materials, and yet we live in worse conditions than in Ukraine, which does not have oil and gas? And the only reason that is the case is because your leaders are mafioso. Russia has been described as a mafia state since 2010. The people who run Russia are mafioso. They steal everything. Unfortunately, the West has helped them in this because the money that they've stolen has gone to Western countries, to like London or to Cyprus or elsewhere. Russians believe this mythology that they are a great power. They're not, and it's very difficult, I think, or becoming very difficult for them to accept this and to realize that what is happening in Ukraine is an embarrassment. Russia, what is happening in Ukraine will mean not only the end of the Russian Empire in this Eurasian sphere of influence, it will mean that the decline of Russia will go faster. Russia is already a younger brother of China. Russia has only two exports: oil and gas and military equipment. Neither of those is now wanted by anybody. The oil sure is exported to India and China, but that's only a small proportion. The gas now, the European Union no longer wants it. The European Union now has understood that it needs to be independent of Russia from energy, and that's positive. And as for military equipment, who's going to buy this really poor quality military equipment? Nobody's going to buy it. Turkey, Philippines, and India have cancelled military contracts. People will buy Bayraktar drones. They will not buy Russian military equipment. So I think what this has shown is that you've had 20 years of stagnation, the building of a mafia state, a kleptocratic state in Russia, which has deepened the decline of Russia as a great power. Putin has not been successful in increasing or improving or rising Russia as a great power, and the war will simply speed that up, and it will help the rise of China. China will benefit the most from this war. China will become, after Russia is defeated, China will become the main enemy of the West, because Russia will be no longer viewed as a serious threat after it's defeated in Ukraine. So I think that Russian elites will find this very difficult to comprehend and to understand what is happening. And also we have to remember that national identities take a long time to change. I mean, they change faster in war, but they still take a long time. I know this from the Polish-Ukrainian relationship and also from the Irish-British. And so we should not expect as Ukrainians that Russians will come to accept Ukraine and Ukrainians as separate to them very quickly. I wrote an article recently which was called "Ukraine's problem is not Putin, Ukraine's problem is Russia," because even if Putin goes, most Russians will continue to see Ukraine as part of Russia and continue to see Ukrainians as some kind of little Russians. So this will be a long process. It will not happen quickly that Russia will come to accept what is happening. I think what will be decided in this war will be the winter period, because I think Ukraine's army will survive the winter better than the Russian army, which means that if for example Ukraine liberates Kherson, can Putin survive another fiasco, another defeat like in Kharkiv? And I'm not so sure. So 2023, we will see many changes and maybe a victory for Ukraine.
Okay, and then here we go with the final question. After Ukraine's victory in this war against Russia, the latter will remain our neighbor, probably in a different form, in a different changed borders. How do you see the future of this declining Russia? What should be Ukraine's policy towards our neighbor and enemy?
Ukraine will have to be the new Israel of Europe. Ukraine will have to continue to invest a high percentage of GDP in defense, because the Russian threat will not go away if Putin tomorrow is removed or dies. But of course, the Russian threat will be weaker if Russia is defeated. But, Russia will then use the period of defeat to rebuild itself and may continue the war down the road. So this Israeli relationship with the Arab world, where sometimes they are weak, sometimes they are strong, will, I think, be similar to Ukraine's relationship with Russia. I am not an optimist that Democrats will come to power in Russia. I don't think that's possible. Most Russian Democrats are kind of nationalists as well, like Navalny, who supports the annexation of Crimea. So I think the relationship with Russia will be tough. But what will have happened once Russia is defeated? Russia will no longer be a threat for at least 5 or 10 years. And until it rebuilds its economy and army, and that will give time for Ukraine to join the West, integrate. Because I think the West, and you mentioned Germany, countries like Germany, I think they've now understand that they cannot allow a gray zone to continue to exist between EU and NATO and Eurasia. This gray zone. Ukraine can no longer remain in the gray zone. The West has to lay claim to Ukraine and to say, the West was always afraid to say Ukraine is part of us because they didn't want to irritate Russia. But today they no longer believe that. So I think in a period of Russian weakness for 10 years or so, Ukraine will be able to rebuild itself as a modern European democracy, as part of the West, with a strong army, strong economy. Russia will be licking its wounds, rebuilding itself, but Russia will continue to be a threat. And so in that sense, Ukraine will have a lot to learn from how Israel has managed to survive since 1947, 48, as an independent country surrounded by enemies. Ukraine would only be surrounded by Russia as an enemy. Now, Russia will also be weakened because as well, it will not have friends. I mean, if Russia is defeated, then Lukashenko will be defeated. So there will be a democratic regime in Belarus. So that will be good for Ukraine as well. So Russia will be, I think, a smaller country. If there is no Putin, there will be no Lukashenko, and there will be no Kadyrov in Chechnya. So Chechnya could be independent also, because these two leaders are connected to Putin. So I think this will give time for Ukraine to rebuild, integrate, and become a better country than it was. It gives Ukraine the opportunities when Russia is a weak and defeated country.
Mr. Kuzyo, thank you so much for this conversation. It was extremely interesting and amazing experience for me. Thank you for your time and for your answers.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And thank you, our dear audience. It was Taras Kuzyo, who was our guest today, and we hope to see you soon on our channel with our new guests.